Listen carefully to the silence that surrounds you now, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the distant hum of the world beyond your walls, but imagine, for just a moment, that there is no world beyond, no walls to contain light or sound, only the infinite embrace of stone and shadow stretching endlessly in every direction, where the concept of sunrise has no meaning, where the word tomorrow carries no promise of illumination, only the endless continuation of a darkness so complete it seems to have weight, pressing down upon everything that dares to exist within its domain. In the hidden valleys of northern China, carved into the limestone cliffs of Tianhuang Mountain, there once thrived a civilization that modern archaeology has barely begun to understand, a people who made their choice to abandon the sun-drenched world above and descend into the embracing darkness of their mountain caves, not for days or months, but for centuries, generation upon generation born into shadow, raised in shadow, living entire lifetimes where the brightest light they ever knew came from the flickering flame of an oil lamp or the dying embers of a carefully tended fire. Before we begin this journey together into the depths of time and stone, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and at what time of day, because as we embark on this exploration of humanity's relationship with darkness, it matters whether you're listening in the bright afternoon sun or in the quiet hours before dawn, whether you're surrounded by the artificial lights of modern civilization or nestled in the natural darkness that our ancestors knew so well. This is the story of the Gaiyaju people, though that name itself is a mystery, a designation given by archaeologists to a civilization that left behind no written records, no clear indication of what they called themselves, only the haunting evidence of their existence carved directly into the living rock, 117 interconnected cave chambers stretching across nearly 25 acres of clifftop real estate, a honeycomb of human habitation that speaks of a society so perfectly adapted to subterranean life that they may have forgotten entirely what it meant to see the sky. The morning sun had not yet burned away the mountain mist, when archaeologist Chen Weiming first glimpsed what would become one of China's most perplexing archaeological mysteries, the limestone cliffs of Tianhuang Mountain revealing themselves slowly through the lifting fog like the face of a sleeping giant, and there, scattered across the cliff face like the empty eye sockets of some ancient skull, dozens upon dozens of dark openings that spoke of human habitation on a scale that defied immediate comprehension. It was 1984, and Chen had been exploring the remote valleys northwest of Beijing, following local legends of ghost caves that the nearby villagers spoke of in hushed tones, stories passed down through generations of strange chambers hidden in the mountain where the spirits of the mountain people still dwelled, places where the living were advised not to venture because the boundary between the world of light and the world of shadow had grown thin, permeable, dangerous to those who belonged fully to neither realm. But Chen was a scientist, trained to see past superstition to the evidence written in stone and earth, and what he saw as he climbed the treacherous paths toward those dark openings was not the realm of spirits, but something far more fascinating and mysterious, the remnants of a sophisticated civilization that had carved an entire city into the living rock, chamber after chamber connected by narrow passages and steep stone stairways, each room shaped with such precision and care that it spoke of master craftsmen who had spent not months or years but decades perfecting their underground art. The caves, he would later learn, had been carved from the inside out, beginning with small natural fissures in the limestone, and gradually expanding them, using nothing more than primitive iron tools and human determination, each chamber shaped to serve a specific purpose in the complex ecosystem of cave life, sleeping quarters with raised stone platforms that would have held wooden beds, storage chambers with carved niches for pottery and grain, workshops where the evidence of metalworking and weaving still clung to the blackened walls, and gathering spaces large enough to hold dozens of people in the warm glow of central fire pits, whose smoke stains still marked the ceilings after centuries of abandonment. As Chen moved deeper into the cave complex, his headlamp beam dancing across walls that showed the tool marks of their ancient carvers, he began to understand that he was exploring not just a shelter or a temporary refuge, but a permanent settlement, a place where people had lived their entire lives from birth to death without ever needing to venture into the outside world, where the architecture itself had been designed to support a completely self-sufficient underground society that could survive indefinitely in the absolute darkness of their mountain fortress. The precision of the construction was staggering, chambers carved at precisely the right angles to ensure proper ventilation, drainage channels cut into the floors to prevent water accumulation, storage areas positioned to take advantage of the mountain's natural temperature variations to preserve food throughout the changing seasons, and everywhere the evidence of a people who understood stone and shadow the way surface dwellers understood wind and weather, who had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed the mountain's moods and adapted their lives accordingly. But perhaps most mysterious of all was what Chen did not find in those carefully carved chambers: no windows, no light shafts, no architectural features that suggested the inhabitants had any interest in maintaining contact with the outside world, as if they had made a conscious decision to sever all ties with the realm of sunlight and sky, to create a civilization that existed entirely within the embrace of eternal night, where the rhythm of days and seasons held no meaning, where time itself was measured not by the movement of the sun but by the slow accumulation of soot on cave walls and the gradual wearing away of stone steps by countless generations of feet moving through passages that never knew the difference between dawn and midnight. The scale of the undertaking became clear, only gradually, as Chen and his team mapped chamber after chamber, passage after passage, realizing that they were exploring not a single cave dwelling but an entire underground city that could have housed several hundred people in complex social arrangements that spoke of sophisticated planning and organization, a society that had somehow managed to thrive in conditions that would challenge even modern humans with all their technological advantages, yet had done so using nothing more than fire, stone tools, and an intimate understanding of how to live in harmony with the eternal darkness that surrounded them. To understand how a people could live for centuries in total darkness, you must first understand how they transformed the raw stone of Tianwang Mountain into something that could sustain human life, not just physically but psychologically, creating spaces that provided not merely shelter but a sense of home, of belonging, of safety in the depths of what most surface dwellers would consider an alien and hostile environment. The genius of Gaiju architecture lay not in its ambition but in its restraint, in the way the cave carvers worked with the natural structure of the limestone rather than against it, following the grain of the rock, exploiting its natural weaknesses, understanding that stone, like wood or water, has its own patterns and preferences, its own ways of wanting to be shaped, and that a master craftsman learns to listen to those preferences rather than imposing arbitrary human designs upon reluctant materials. Each chamber began as a natural crack or fissure in the cliff face, places where winter frost and summer heat had already begun the work of splitting the stone, and the cave carvers would widen these openings using fire and water, heating the rock with carefully built fires until it expanded, then shocking it with cold water until it contracted and cracked along predictable lines, a process that required intimate knowledge of how limestone behaves under thermal stress, knowledge that could only be gained through generations of experimentation and careful observation. The rooms themselves were never carved to arbitrary human dimensions, but shaped to take advantage of the stone's natural strength, with curved ceilings that distributed weight evenly and prevented collapse, walls that followed the mountain's own structural lines, floors that sloped just enough to ensure drainage without creating uncomfortable living spaces, every detail considered not just for immediate human comfort, but for the long-term stability of the entire cave system. Because a ceiling collapse or a flooded chamber could mean death for an entire family in a world where retreat to the surface was not an acceptable option. But the true sophistication of Gaiju architecture revealed itself not in individual chambers, but in the connections between them, the narrow passages and steep stairways that linked the cave system into a coherent whole, creating what amounted to underground neighborhoods where extended families could live in close proximity while maintaining their privacy, where communal spaces for cooking and gathering were balanced against intimate chambers for sleeping and solitude, where the flow of air and people through the passages was carefully managed to ensure that the cave system functioned as a living, breathing organism rather than a collection of isolated holes in the rock. The ventilation system was perhaps the most crucial element of cave architecture, because without proper air circulation, the cave dwellers would have quickly suffocated in the smoke from their fires or died from the accumulation of carbon dioxide from their own breathing, and the architects of Gyaju had solved this problem through an ingenious system of natural and artificial air shafts that drew fresh air from the outside world while expelling stale air and smoke, creating subtle currents that moved through the entire cave system like the circulation of blood through a living body. These air currents served multiple purposes beyond mere ventilation. They carried sounds from chamber to chamber, allowing the cave dwellers to communicate across distances without having to physically travel through the passages. They distributed the warmth from central fires throughout the living spaces, making it possible to heat the entire cave system with relatively few fuel sources, and they provided a kind of atmospheric information system that allowed experienced cave dwellers to monitor weather conditions on the surface, to sense approaching storms or seasonal changes, to maintain their connection to the natural world even while living completely removed from it. The acoustic properties of the caves were equally sophisticated, with chambers shaped to enhance certain types of sounds while dampening others, creating spaces where whispered conversations could be carried on in private despite the proximity of neighbors, where the sounds of daily work, the grinding of grain, the weaving of cloth, the sharpening of tools were absorbed and muffled so as not to disturb the rest of the community, where the natural resonance of the stone could be used to amplify important sounds like calls for help or announcements of community gatherings. Storage was another critical consideration in a world where every scrap of food and every tool had to be carefully preserved against an uncertain future, where there were no markets to visit, no neighboring farms to trade with, no possibility of resupplying from the outside world, and the cave architects had created an elaborate system of storage niches, granaries, and underground chambers, where the cave dwellers could stockpile everything they needed to survive the lean times that inevitably came in any subsistence society, but were particularly dangerous for a people who had no option of seasonal migration or trade relationships with surface communities. The psychological aspects of cave architecture were perhaps the most subtle but equally important, because humans are not naturally creatures of eternal darkness, and living in such conditions without developing claustrophobia, depression, or other psychological disorders required careful attention to the ways that architectural spaces could provide comfort and security, rather than anxiety and fear. And the cave designers had achieved this through careful attention to proportions, to the play of light and shadow from oil lamps and fires, to the creation of spaces that felt protective rather than imprisoning, nurturing rather than threatening. Imagine, if you can, the moment of birth in the depths of Gyaju caves, the first breath drawn not in the bright sterile light of a modern hospital but in the warm flickering glow of oil lamps, where the newborn's eyes opened not to windows and sunlight but to stone walls carved by their great-grandparents' hands, where the first sounds to reach their ears were not the bustle of a daytime world but the eternal whispers of air moving through stone passages, the distant murmur of voices echoing from chamber to chamber, the soft crackling of fires that had been burning continuously for generations, tended by hands that had never known what it meant to flip a switch and banish darkness with the simple gesture of modern convenience. These children of the cave were born into a world where darkness was not the absence of light, but the natural state of existence, where the gentle glow of flame was not a temporary reprieve from shadow but the normal condition of visibility, where the concepts of day and night, sunrise and sunset, held no meaning beyond the abstract stories that their elders might tell of the strange world that existed somewhere above their stone ceiling, a world of impossible brightness and uncomfortable exposure, a world where people somehow managed to live their lives constantly illuminated, constantly visible, constantly vulnerable to the harsh judgment of unlimited sight. The cave children learned to navigate their world through senses that surface children barely develop, their fingers reading the texture of stone walls like others might read books, their ears trained to distinguish between the footsteps of different family members approaching through the passages, between the sound of water dripping from limestone formations and the more dangerous sound of water seeping through cracks that might indicate structural problems, between the normal settling sounds of an ancient cave system and the subtle changes in air pressure that might herald the approach of surface weather that could affect the ventilation system. Their games were not the games of surface children, played in bright sunlight with toys that relied on color and visual appeal, but games adapted to the particular constraints and opportunities of cave life, elaborate hide-and-seek contests that could span multiple chambers and require intimate knowledge of every passage and alcove, storytelling games that relied entirely on voice and imagination, since visual props were limited, musical games that took advantage of the cave's natural acoustics to create haunting melodies that resonated through the stone chambers like the voices of the mountain itself singing its ancient songs. The education of cave children was necessarily different from that of their surface counterparts, focused not on reading and writing, skills that required more light than the cave economy could reasonably provide, but on the practical knowledge needed for survival in their unique environment, how to maintain fires without wasting precious fuel, how to work stone and metal in conditions of limited visibility, how to preserve food in the cave's natural refrigeration system, how to navigate the passages safely in complete darkness, how to interpret the subtle signs that revealed the mountain's changing moods and seasonal cycles. But perhaps most importantly, cave children learned to live without the psychological dependence on external light that defined surface existence, developing instead an internal sense of illumination that came from their deep connection to their physical environment, their intimate knowledge of every stone and passage in their underground world, their ability to find comfort and security in conditions that would terrorize most modern humans, their understanding that darkness was not something to be feared or overcome, but something to be embraced as the natural condition of their particular form of human existence. The socialization of cave children was necessarily intense and comprehensive, since the small size of their community meant that every individual needed to master multiple skills and play multiple roles in the survival of the group. There were no specialists who could devote their entire lives to single occupations, no luxury of allowing some individuals to remain helpless or dependent, no possibility of supporting members who could not contribute to the collective welfare of the community, and children learned from an early age that their individual survival was inseparably linked to their ability to function as productive members of their cave society. The coming-of-age rituals for cave children would have been particularly significant, marking not just the transition from childhood to adulthood, but the moment when young people proved their mastery of the complex skills needed for independent survival in the cave environment, perhaps including solo journeys through the most challenging passages of the cave system, demonstrations of their ability to maintain fires and preserve food, tests of their knowledge of the cave's acoustic and ventilation systems, rituals that confirmed their readiness to take full responsibility for their own survival and contribute to the survival of the next generation. The psychological resilience required of cave children was extraordinary by any measure, since they needed to develop not only physical skills but the mental and emotional strength to live their entire lives in conditions of sensory deprivation that would challenge even trained cave explorers for short periods, to find meaning and purpose in a world that offered none of the visual stimulation and variety that most humans crave, to build rich inner lives that could provide the emotional sustenance normally derived from engagement with a complex and visually appealing external environment. Yet the evidence suggests that these children not only survived but thrived in their underground world, developing into adults who were so perfectly adapted to cave life that they apparently saw no reason to abandon their stone chambers for the uncertain advantages of surface existence, who found in the depths of Tianhuang Mountain everything they needed for physical survival and psychological fulfillment, who created a viable alternative to the surface world that lasted for centuries and might have continued indefinitely if not for circumstances that remain as mysterious as almost everything else about their remarkable civilization. Communication in the Gyaju caves developed along pathways that surface dwellers can barely imagine, where the absence of visual cues forced the evolution of linguistic and non-linguistic systems of extraordinary sophistication, where every whisper carried weight, because it might need to travel through stone passages to reach its intended recipient, where every spoken word was precious because the acoustic environment of the caves meant that speech could either be perfectly preserved and transmitted or completely lost in the absorbing embrace of limestone walls, depending on how skillfully the speaker understood and utilized the particular acoustic properties of their underground environment. The cave dwellers would have developed an intimate understanding of how sound behaved in their stone world, learning to modulate their voices not just for volume but for the specific frequencies that traveled best through different types of passages, discovering that certain tones would resonate through the entire cave system while others would be absorbed and muffled within a single chamber, understanding that the placement of the speaker within a room, the direction they faced, the way they shaped their mouth and throat, could dramatically affect whether their words reached their intended audience or vanished into the acoustic complexity of interconnected stone spaces. But beyond the mechanics of sound transmission, the cave dwellers would have needed to develop linguistic structures adapted to the constraints of their environment, languages that could convey complex information quickly and efficiently, because every conversation required careful attention to acoustic conditions, vocabularies that emphasized precision over redundancy, because misunderstandings in a cave environment could have life-threatening consequences, grammatical structures that allowed for maximum information density, because the luxury of lengthy explanations was not always available in a world where every word required the expenditure of precious breath and the careful management of acoustic resources. The development of non-verbal communication systems would have been equally sophisticated, with touch languages that allowed cave dwellers to communicate in complete silence when necessary, perhaps during hunting expeditions to the surface world where sound might alert prey or predators, or during emergency situations where verbal communication might interfere with the careful listening required to assess dangerous conditions. Systems of tactile signals that could be transmitted through stone walls by tapping or scratching, allowing communication between chambers without requiring physical movement through the connecting passages. The social implications of acoustic communication in the caves were profound, since privacy in the traditional sense was virtually impossible when voices could carry through stone walls and connecting passages, creating a community where individual secrets were difficult to maintain and collective knowledge was naturally shared, where the acoustic transparency of the cave environment enforced a kind of social honesty that surface communities achieve only through conscious effort and deliberate institutional structures. This acoustic intimacy would have had particularly significant effects on child rearing, since children would have been constantly exposed to adult conversations and community decisions, learning not just through direct instruction but through constant eavesdropping on the full range of community life, developing a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and community problems from a very early age, growing up with a sense of full membership in the community rather than the protected isolation that surface cultures often impose on their young. The cave dwellers would also have developed sophisticated systems of acoustic navigation, learning to interpret the subtle echoes and sound reflections that revealed the size and shape of spaces in complete darkness, understanding how their own breathing and heartbeats were modified by different acoustic environments, developing the ability to map their underground world through sound alone, to identify their location within the cave system by the particular acoustic signature of each chamber and passage. Musical traditions in the caves would have been extraordinary, taking advantage of the natural resonance and reverberation of stone chambers to create acoustic effects impossible in surface environments, with singing traditions that utilized the cave's ability to sustain and harmonize multiple voices, instrumental music adapted to the particular acoustic properties of limestone formations, perhaps including the use of stalactites and flowstone formations as natural percussion instruments whose tones were shaped by thousands of years of mineral deposition. The preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge would have relied heavily on oral traditions of exceptional sophistication, since written records were impractical in the limited light conditions of cave life, and the cave dwellers would have developed systems of storytelling, song, and recitation that could preserve not just historical information but technical knowledge, social customs, religious beliefs, and practical skills, with memory techniques adapted to the acoustic environment of the caves, using the natural reverberations and echoes to enhance memorization and recall. The acoustic environment would also have shaped the cave dwellers' understanding of time and rhythm, since without the visual cues of sunrise and sunset, day and night, their temporal awareness would have been based on other cyclical patterns, the regular activities of community life, the rhythm of breathing and heartbeats amplified by stone acoustics, the subtle changes in air pressure and cave acoustics that might reflect surface weather conditions, creating a temporal consciousness based on sound and community rather than light and celestial movement. The spiritual dimensions of acoustic communication in the caves would have been particularly profound, since the natural reverberation and echo effects of limestone chambers could create acoustic experiences that seemed to come from beyond the physical world, where whispered prayers or chanted rituals could seem to be answered by the voice of the mountain itself. where the acoustic properties of certain chambers might have been interpreted as evidence of supernatural presence or spiritual significance, leading to the development of religious traditions uniquely adapted to the acoustic possibilities of underground existence. Survival in the Gyaju caves required the development of an economic system unlike anything that surface civilizations had ever needed to create, an economy of absolute scarcity, where every calorie consumed, every tool manufactured, every raw material utilized had to be carefully planned and accounted for, because there were no external sources of supply, no possibility of trade relationships with neighboring communities, no seasonal migration patterns that could provide access to different resource bases, only the finite resources that could be obtained from the mountain itself and the limited materials that could be gathered during carefully planned expeditions to the dangerous surface world. The cave dwellers would have needed to develop systems of resource management that would challenge even modern sustainability experts, calculating not just their immediate needs, but their long-term requirements across multiple generations, understanding that every decision about resource allocation today would have consequences for their children and grandchildren who would inherit the results of current consumption patterns, planning for contingencies and emergencies that might require extended periods of complete isolation from any external resource sources. Food production and preservation would have been the central challenge of cave economics, since the cave environment, while providing certain advantages for food storage, offered virtually no opportunities for agriculture in the traditional sense, requiring the cave dwellers to develop alternative food systems based on hunting, gathering, and perhaps limited forms of controlled cultivation that could be maintained in the specific microclimatic conditions available within the cave system. The cave's natural refrigeration properties would have been crucial for food preservation, with different chambers offering different temperature and humidity conditions that could be used to store different types of food for extended periods, perhaps including natural ice chambers where frozen foods could be preserved throughout the year, fermentation chambers where the controlled bacterial processes could be used to create preserved foods with extended shelf life, drying chambers where the cave's natural air circulation could be used to dehydrate foods for long-term storage. Hunting expeditions to the surface world would have required careful planning and coordination, since the cave dwellers would have needed to venture into a bright, visually complex environment for which their eyes and reflexes were poorly adapted, requiring them to develop hunting techniques and equipment specifically designed for people whose vision was adapted to low-light conditions, whose movement patterns were shaped by navigating narrow stone passages rather than open terrain, whose understanding of animal behavior was necessarily limited by their restricted experience with surface ecosystems. The manufacture of tools and equipment within the caves would have required extraordinary ingenuity, since traditional metalworking and crafting techniques were designed for surface conditions with unlimited ventilation and abundant light. But the cave dwellers would have needed to adapt these processes to work within the constraints of their underground environment, developing forge and workshop systems that could operate safely within stone chambers without creating dangerous accumulations of smoke or toxic fumes, creating lighting systems that provided sufficient illumination for detailed craftwork without consuming excessive amounts of precious fuel. The cave economy would also have required sophisticated systems of internal trade and resource distribution, since different individuals and families would have had different skills and specializations, different access to various types of resources, different needs based on their age, health, and family size, requiring community mechanisms for ensuring that essential resources reached everyone who needed them, that individual expertise was shared for the benefit of the entire community, that conflicts over resource allocation were resolved peacefully and fairly. Water management would have been another critical aspect of cave economics, since while the limestone caves would have provided natural sources of fresh water through underground springs and seasonal runoff, the cave dwellers would have needed to develop systems for collecting, storing, and distributing water throughout their underground community, ensuring that every chamber had reliable access to clean water, that contamination was prevented, that seasonal variations in water availability were managed through careful storage and conservation practices. The economics of energy production and consumption would have been particularly challenging, since the cave dwellers would have been entirely dependent on combustible materials for heating, cooking, lighting, and industrial processes, requiring them to develop sustainable systems for gathering and managing fuel sources, perhaps including carefully managed forestry practices on the surface, sophisticated systems for collecting and processing various types of biomass, efficient burning techniques that maximized heat and light output while minimizing fuel consumption and smoke production. Waste management in the cave environment would have required systems of extraordinary sophistication, since improper disposal of human waste, food scraps and manufacturing byproducts could quickly create sanitation problems that would threaten the health of the entire community. But the cave dwellers would have had limited options for waste disposal and would have needed to develop recycling and processing systems that turned waste products into useful resources rather than simply disposing of them in ways that might contaminate their living environment. The psychological economics of cave life would have been equally important, since the constraints of underground existence would have required community members to find meaning and satisfaction in work and consumption patterns that were necessarily limited compared to surface civilizations, developing cultural values that emphasized cooperation over competition, sustainability over growth, quality over quantity, finding ways to create rich and fulfilling lives within the inherent limitations of their unique economic system. The long-term sustainability of the cave economy would have depended on maintaining a delicate balance between population size and resource availability, developing social institutions that could prevent overpopulation while ensuring that the community maintained sufficient genetic diversity and human resources to continue functioning across multiple generations, creating economic incentives that encouraged behaviors that supported long-term community survival, while discouraging activities that might threaten the sustainability of their unique way of life. In the depths of Tian Huang Mountain, where the concept of sunrise held no meaning, and the passage of seasons could only be sensed through subtle changes in air pressure and the behavior of underground water sources, the cave dwellers would have needed to create their own systems of ritual and ceremony to mark the significant moments of individual and community life, to provide the psychological anchoring that most human societies derive from their connection to celestial cycles and seasonal rhythms, to create meaning and continuity in an environment that offered none of the natural temporal markers that surface civilizations take for granted. The most fundamental rituals would have centered around fire, since flame was not just a practical necessity for survival, but the primary source of light and warmth that made human life possible in the caves, and the cave dwellers would likely have developed elaborate ceremonies around the lighting of new fires, the transfer of flame from generation to generation, the communal maintenance of central fires that burned continuously throughout the life of the community, rituals that acknowledged fire not just as a tool but as a sacred force that enabled their unique form of human existence. Birth ceremonies in the caves would have been particularly poignant, since the arrival of new life in the depths of the mountain represented both hope for the continuation of the community and an additional burden on the limited resources available for survival, requiring rituals that welcomed new community members while acknowledging the responsibilities that their arrival placed upon the entire group, perhaps including naming ceremonies that connected newborns to the specific stones and passages where they would spend their lives, blessing rituals that invoked the protection of the mountain spirits for the vulnerable new life beginning its existence in the eternal shadow. Coming-of-age rituals would have been crucial for establishing the readiness of young people to take full responsibility for their own survival and contribute to the welfare of the community, perhaps including solo journeys through the most challenging passages of the cave system, tests of navigation skills in complete darkness, demonstrations of fire-making abilities and tool-crafting expertise, initiation ceremonies that marked the transition from protected childhood to the full responsibilities of adult membership in a community where individual competence was essential for collective survival. Marriage ceremonies would have had particular significance in a small, isolated community where mate selection was limited and genetic diversity was a constant concern, requiring rituals that not only celebrated the union of individuals but acknowledged their responsibility to the long-term survival of the community, perhaps including ceremonies that connected the new couple to specific chambers or sections of the cave system that would become their family territory, blessing rituals that invoked fertility while acknowledging the need to balance population growth with resource availability. Death rituals in the caves would have been especially complex, since traditional burial practices were impossible in the stone environment, and the disposal of human remains required careful attention to sanitation and community health. perhaps leading to the development of unique mortuary practices adapted to the cave environment, possibly including the use of specific chambers or passages as ossuary sites where the bones of ancestors could be preserved and honored, ceremonies that acknowledged the return of community members to the stone from which their lives had been carved. Seasonal rituals would have required extraordinary creativity, since the cave dwellers would have had no direct experience of the changing seasons, but would have needed to maintain some connection to the natural cycles that governed life on the surface world, perhaps developing ceremonies based on subtle changes in cave acoustics, air pressure, or water flow that reflected seasonal changes on the surface, rituals that acknowledged their connection to the larger natural world despite their physical separation from it. Community healing rituals would have been essential for maintaining the psychological health of individuals living under the stress of constant darkness and social proximity, perhaps including ceremonies that used the natural acoustics of the caves for therapeutic purposes, group singing or chanting rituals that took advantage of the stone chamber's ability to create haunting harmonies and reverberations, meditation practices adapted to the sensory conditions of cave life, communal ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and provided emotional support for individuals struggling with the psychological challenges of underground existence. Religious ceremonies would likely have been centered around the cave system itself, with specific chambers or geological formations serving as sacred sites where the cave dwellers could connect with whatever spiritual forces they believed governed their existence, perhaps including rituals that acknowledged the mountain as a living entity that sheltered and protected them, ceremonies that honored the ancient geological processes that had created their stone sanctuary, spiritual practices that found the sacred in the eternal darkness rather than seeking connection to distant celestial forces. Storytelling rituals would have been crucial for preserving community history and cultural knowledge across generations, since written records were impractical in the limited light conditions of cave life, requiring the development of sophisticated oral traditions that could preserve not just entertainment but essential technical knowledge, social customs, historical information, and spiritual beliefs, with storytelling ceremonies that used the acoustic properties of the caves to create immersive narrative experiences that were as much performance as information transmission. Conflict resolution rituals would have been essential for maintaining community harmony in conditions where individuals were in constant close proximity, and where unresolved disputes could threaten the survival of the entire group, perhaps including ceremonial processes for mediating disagreements, restorative justice practices that focused on maintaining community cohesion rather than punishing individual wrongdoing, reconciliation rituals that used the acoustic intimacy of the cave environment to facilitate honest communication and mutual understanding. Work rituals would have been necessary to coordinate the complex labor requirements of cave life, perhaps including ceremonies that marked the beginning of major construction projects, seasonal work periods, or other collaborative efforts that required the participation of the entire community, blessing rituals for tools and equipment that were essential for survival, thanksgiving ceremonies that acknowledged successful completion of important work projects that enhanced the community's chances of long-term survival. To understand how human beings could not merely survive but thrive for centuries in conditions of total darkness, we must venture into the deepest territories of human psychology, exploring how the mind adapts when deprived of the visual stimulation that most people consider essential for normal mental function, how consciousness itself transforms when forced to operate within the sensory constraints of eternal shadow, how the cave dwellers of Gyaju developed psychological resilience that would challenge our modern understanding of what human beings require for mental health and emotional well-being. The absence of natural light would have triggered profound neurochemical changes in the cave dwellers' brains, since human circadian rhythms are normally regulated by exposure to sunlight, and life in permanent darkness would have required the development of alternative biological clocks based on community activities, mealtimes, sleep cycles, and social interactions rather than the solar patterns that govern most human societies, leading to neurological adaptations that allowed the cave dwellers to maintain healthy sleep-wake cycles and emotional stability without the biochemical cues that most humans depend upon for psychological balance. The psychological impact of living in constant close proximity to other community members would have been enormous, since the cave environment provided virtually no opportunity for the kind of solitude and privacy that most people require for psychological health, requiring the development of mental techniques for maintaining individual identity and emotional equilibrium while living in conditions that would challenge even highly trained astronauts or submarine crews, who endure similar conditions only for limited periods with the knowledge that they will eventually return to normal social environments. The cave dwellers would have needed to develop extraordinary skills of mental visualization and imagination, since their external environment provided relatively little visual variety or stimulation, requiring them to create rich inner worlds that could provide the mental stimulation and creative satisfaction that surface dwellers derive from engagement with visually complex and ever-changing external environments, developing forms of internal entertainment, intellectual exploration, and creative expression that were independent of external visual input. The absence of horizons and distant views would have had profound psychological effects, since human mental health is normally supported by the ability to focus on distant objects and expansive vistas that provide a sense of space and freedom, but the cave dwellers would have been confined to the intimate scale of stone chambers and narrow passages, requiring the development of psychological techniques for managing claustrophobia and maintaining a sense of spaciousness and freedom within inherently confining physical conditions. Memory and navigation skills would have developed to extraordinary levels, since movement through the cave system required the ability to maintain detailed mental maps of complex three-dimensional spaces without visual landmarks, developing forms of spatial intelligence that far exceeded normal human capabilities, creating mental filing systems that could store and retrieve precise information about hundreds of passages, chambers, and connecting routes based entirely on tactile, auditory, and kinesthetic cues. The development of enhanced non-visual senses would have been crucial for psychological adaptation, since the absence of sight would have forced the cave dwellers to rely much more heavily on hearing, touch, smell, and proprioception for gathering information about their environment, leading to sensory abilities that would seem almost supernatural to surface dwellers, including the ability to navigate in complete darkness, to identify individuals by their breathing patterns and footstep rhythms, to detect subtle changes in air pressure and cave acoustics that revealed important information about conditions both within the cave system and on the surface world above. Social psychology in the caves would have been extraordinarily complex, since the acoustic transparency of the cave environment meant that individual privacy was virtually impossible, requiring the development of social conventions and psychological techniques that allowed community members to maintain their mental health and individual identity while living in conditions of constant mutual awareness, developing forms of psychological privacy that were based on internal mental discipline rather than physical separation. The management of fear and anxiety would have been a constant psychological challenge, since cave environments naturally trigger claustrophobic responses in most humans, and the cave dwellers would have needed to develop sophisticated mental techniques for overcoming these natural fear responses, perhaps including meditation practices, breathing techniques, mental imagery exercises, and other psychological tools that could maintain emotional equilibrium in conditions that would induce panic in most surface dwellers. The absence of seasonal cycles and natural temporal markers would have required the development of alternative psychological rhythms based on community activities and social cycles rather than natural phenomena, creating forms of mental timekeeping that were based on human relationships and cultural activities rather than celestial movements, developing psychological systems for maintaining hope, purpose, and forward momentum without the natural renewal and variation that seasonal changes provide for most human societies. Child psychology in the cave environment would have been particularly complex, since children's normal psychological development depends heavily on visual stimulation, exploration of varied environments, and gradual expansion of their known world. But cave children would have needed to develop healthy psychological patterns within the inherent constraints of underground existence, requiring parenting techniques and educational approaches specifically adapted to the unique challenges and opportunities of cave life. The development of meaning and purpose in cave life would have required extraordinary psychological creativity, since the cave dwellers would have needed to find fulfillment and satisfaction in ways of life that were necessarily limited compared to the opportunities available to surface civilizations, developing philosophical and spiritual systems that could provide deep meaning and purpose within the inherent constraints of their underground existence, creating forms of human flourishing that were adapted to the particular possibilities and limitations of life in eternal shadow. The psychological legacy of cave adaptation would have been profound, since individuals who spent their entire lives adapted to cave conditions would have developed forms of mental functioning that were fundamentally different from surface dwellers, with enhanced abilities in some areas and limitations in others, creating a unique form of human consciousness that was perfectly adapted to their underground environment, but might have been challenged by sudden exposure to the overwhelming sensory complexity of surface life. Within the honeycomb chambers of Tianhuang Mountain, the cave dwellers would have developed a spiritual understanding of their environment that transformed every passage, every chamber, every carved niche from mere functional space into sacred geography, where the very stones that surrounded them were not simply raw material for construction, but living participants in a cosmic order that connected their underground world to forces and meanings that transcended the immediate practical concerns of daily survival. The mountain itself would have been understood not as a passive container for human habitation, but as a conscious entity with its own moods, rhythms, and intentions, whose subtle movements and changes provided guidance and warnings to those who learned to interpret its signals, whose ancient geological processes had created the cave system, not through random chance, but through purposeful action, that prepared the mountain to serve as sanctuary and protector for the human community that would eventually make its home within the living rock. Each chamber within the cave system would have developed its own spiritual significance based on its particular acoustic properties, its geological features, its role in community life, and the accumulated memory of the human activities that had taken place within its stone walls, creating a complex sacred landscape where different spaces served different spiritual functions, where certain chambers were appropriate for meditation and prayer, others for community rituals and ceremonies, still others for the solemn business of connecting with ancestral spirits and seeking guidance from forces beyond the physical world. The acoustic properties of the caves would have been understood as spiritual phenomena, rather than merely physical effects, since the way that sound behaved within the stone chambers, the reverberations and echoes, the way certain tones seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, the manner in which whispered words could carry through passages while louder sounds were absorbed and muffled, would have been interpreted as evidence that the mountain itself was participating in human communication, that the stone was listening to human speech and responding according to its own mysterious purposes. Water sources within the caves would have held particular spiritual significance, since the underground springs and seasonal seeps that provided essential drinking water would have been understood as gifts from the deeper earth, as connections to underground rivers and aquifers that linked the cave system to distant places and ancient times, as sacred wells where the boundary between the human world and the realm of earth spirits was particularly thin and permeable, requiring special rituals and offerings to ensure the continued flow of life-giving water. The darkness itself would have been understood not as the absence of light, but as a positive spiritual force, a sacred condition that provided protection from the harsh judgments and dangerous exposures of the surface world, a holy shadow that embraced and sheltered the cave community, a form of divine presence that was uniquely available to those who had the courage and wisdom to abandon the false illumination of sunlight and embrace the deeper truth that could only be found in the eternal night of the underground world. Fire would have held the most complex spiritual significance, since flame was simultaneously the force that made human life possible in the caves and the element that connected the cave dwellers to the upper world of air and sky, the sacred bridge between the realm of stone and shadow and the distant realm of sun and wind, requiring elaborate rituals and taboos to ensure that fire was treated with the respect due to such a powerful and essential spiritual force. The tool marks and carved surfaces that covered the cave walls would have been understood as a form of sacred text, where the accumulated work of generations of cave dwellers had written the story of their community directly into the living stone, where every chisel mark and carved channel was a prayer made manifest, a connection between human intention and geological reality, a form of communion between the cave dwellers and the mountain that sheltered them. Specific geological formations within the caves, stalactites and flowstone formations, natural pillars and archways, chambers where the limestone had been shaped by water into particularly striking or unusual configurations, would have been recognized as sacred sites where the mountain's own creative power was most clearly visible, where the slow geological processes that had shaped the cave system over millions of years had produced features that seemed to have been designed specifically for spiritual contemplation and ritual use. The boundaries between different chambers and passages would have been understood as spiritual thresholds, places where individuals moved not just from one physical space to another, but from one spiritual condition to another, requiring ritual preparations and mental adjustments that acknowledged the sacred significance of movement through the cave system, the way that different spaces within the mountain called for different states of consciousness and different forms of spiritual awareness. The disposal of human waste and the management of death within the cave system would have required elaborate spiritual protocols, since contamination of the sacred cave environment would have been understood not just as a practical problem, but as a spiritual crisis that could threaten the relationship between the human community and the mountain spirits that protected them, requiring purification rituals and restorative ceremonies that could repair any damage to the sacred balance that sustained life in the underground world. The relationship between the cave community and the surface world would have been understood in spiritual rather than merely practical terms, with expeditions to gather resources or hunt game interpreted as dangerous journeys into a spiritually alien environment where different rules applied and different protective rituals were required, where the cave dwellers needed to maintain their spiritual connection to the sacred underground while temporarily exposing themselves to the hazardous spiritual influences of the sun-drenched surface world. Seasonal changes that affected the cave system, variations in water flow, changes in air pressure and cave acoustics that reflected surface weather patterns, the subtle ways that the mountain's behavior changed with the passage of time, would have been interpreted as communications from the larger spiritual forces that governed both the underground and surface worlds, requiring careful attention and interpretation by individuals who specialized in reading the mountain's moods and translating its messages for the benefit of the entire community. The ultimate spiritual significance of cave life would have been understood as a form of voluntary exile from the ordinary human world, a choice to live more closely connected to the fundamental forces of earth and stone that most surface dwellers ignored or forgot, a commitment to a form of existence that required greater spiritual discipline and awareness, but also provided access to forms of truth and wisdom that were not available to those who remained trapped in the illusions and distractions of surface life. The most haunting question that echoes through the empty chambers of Gyaju caves is not how the cave dwellers managed to survive for centuries in conditions of total darkness, but why they eventually chose to abandon their stone sanctuary, leaving behind a perfectly functional underground city that could have continued to shelter their descendants for generations to come, walking away from a way of life that their ancestors had spent centuries perfecting, surrendering their unique adaptation to cave existence and venturing into a surface world for which they were poorly prepared, and which offered no obvious advantages over the security and sustainability of their mountain refuge. The archaeological evidence provides few clues about the timing or circumstances of the abandonment, since the cave dwellers left behind no written records to explain their decision, no clear signs of violence or natural disaster that might have forced their departure, no indication that the cave system had become uninhabitable, or that some catastrophic failure had made their underground life impossible to continue. Only the silent testimony of empty chambers and cold fire pits that speak of a community that simply vanished, leaving their stone city as perfectly preserved as if they had intended to return the next day. One possibility is that the abandonment was gradual rather than sudden, with individuals and families slowly drifting away from cave life over a period of years or decades, perhaps attracted by opportunities in the surface world that seemed more promising than the constrained existence available in the caves, perhaps driven by conflicts within the community that made continued coexistence impossible, perhaps simply motivated by curiosity about the world beyond their stone walls and a desire to experience forms of life that were impossible within the inherent limitations of underground existence. The demographic pressures of cave life would have made abandonment almost inevitable in the long term, since the cave system could support only a limited population, and any significant population growth would have created resource shortages and social tensions that could have made continued cave life unsustainable, forcing the community to make difficult choices about population control or territorial expansion that might have ultimately led to the decision to seek new opportunities in the surface world rather than continuing to struggle with the constraints of their underground environment. Climate change on the surface world might have played a role in the abandonment, since the cave dwellers would have maintained some awareness of surface conditions through their hunting and gathering expeditions, and significant changes in surface climate, whether warming trends that made surface life more attractive or cooling periods that reduced the availability of surface resources, could have influenced their calculations about the relative advantages of cave versus surface existence, leading to a collective decision that the time had come to abandon their underground refuge. Political pressures from surface civilizations might have forced the abandonment, since the cave dwellers could not have remained completely isolated from the larger political and military developments that shaped medieval Chinese history, and the expansion of imperial authority, or the conflicts between competing warlords might have made their mountain refuge untenable, either through direct military pressure or through the disruption of the surface resources that supplemented their cave-based subsistence system. Disease outbreaks within the cave community could have triggered abandonment, since the close quarters and limited genetic diversity of cave life would have made the community vulnerable to epidemic diseases that could have decimated their population, and survivors of such outbreaks might have concluded that their way of life was no longer viable, that the risks of continued cave existence outweighed the security that their stone sanctuary had traditionally provided. The psychological pressures of cave life might have gradually accumulated over generations until they became unbearable, since even the most perfectly adapted cave dwellers might have eventually succumbed to claustrophobia, depression, or other forms of mental distress that made continued underground existence impossible, leading to a collective psychological crisis that could only be resolved through abandonment of the cave system and return to the surface world, regardless of the practical difficulties that such a transition would entail. Religious or spiritual factors might have motivated the abandonment, since the cave dwellers might have concluded that their relationship with the mountain spirits had changed, that the sacred geography of their stone world no longer provided the spiritual protection and guidance that had sustained their ancestors, that some fundamental shift in the cosmic order required them to abandon their underground sanctuary and seek new forms of spiritual connection in the surface world. The arrival of new technologies or social systems that were incompatible with cave life might have made abandonment seem attractive or necessary, since the cave dwellers would have had some contact with surface civilizations, and might have been exposed to innovations in agriculture, metalworking, transportation, or social organization that offered significant advantages, but could not be implemented within the constraints of their underground environment, leading to a collective decision that the benefits of adopting these new ways of life outweighed the security of continuing their traditional cave existence. The loss of essential knowledge or skills might have made continued cave life impossible, since the successful maintenance of the cave community required sophisticated technical knowledge about ventilation, water management, food preservation, and other specialized skills that might have been lost through accidents, deaths of key individuals, or gradual erosion of traditional learning systems, leaving the community unable to maintain the complex infrastructure that made underground life possible. Environmental changes within the cave system itself might have forced abandonment, since limestone caves are dynamic environments that continue to evolve through geological processes, and changes in water flow, air circulation, structural stability, or other essential features of the cave system might have made continued habitation dangerous or impossible, forcing the cave dwellers to abandon their stone city, regardless of their preferences or the attractiveness of alternative living arrangements. The mystery of abandonment remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the Gaiju story, since it raises fundamental questions about human adaptability, the sustainability of alternative lifestyles, and the factors that determine whether unusual forms of human civilization can survive and thrive over extended periods. Questions that have relevance not just for understanding ancient history, but for considering contemporary challenges of sustainability, community formation, and adaptation to environmental constraints. When archaeologist Chen Weiming first began mapping the Gaiju cave system in the 1980s, He could not have anticipated that his discovery would eventually connect to a global pattern of human adaptation to underground environments, that the mysterious cave dwellers of Tianhuang Mountain were part of a larger human story that stretched across continents and millennia, involving cultures as diverse as the troglodytes of Tunisia, the Yardong communities of China's Laos Plateau, the underground cities of Cappadocia, and dozens of other societies that had chosen to make their homes beneath the surface of the earth. The archaeological evidence from Gaiachu reveals construction techniques and living arrangements that parallel those found in underground communities from Morocco to Turkey to New Mexico, suggesting that when human beings are faced with the challenge of creating permanent habitation in cave environments, they consistently develop similar solutions to problems of ventilation, water management, food storage, and social organization, creating a kind of universal grammar of cave architecture that transcends cultural boundaries and appears independently wherever humans choose to adapt their lives to subterranean conditions. The precision of stone carving techniques found at Gaiaju matches the quality of work found in the most sophisticated cave cities of the ancient world, indicating that the cave dwellers possessed metalworking skills and architectural knowledge comparable to the master builders who created the underground complexes of Derinkuyu and Kamakla in Cappadocia, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in Colorado, and the rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, suggesting that cave architecture represented not a primitive or desperate response to harsh conditions but a sophisticated technological achievement that required advanced planning and execution. Carbon dating of organic materials found within the Gyeongju caves has provided tantalizing but incomplete information about the timeline of occupation, suggesting that the cave system was actively inhabited for several centuries during the medieval period, roughly contemporaneous with the great flowering of cave-dwelling communities across Asia and the Mediterranean, indicating that the choice to live underground was not an isolated phenomenon but part of a broader pattern of human adaptation to environmental and social pressures that affected multiple civilizations during this historical period. The absence of written records at Gyeongju is typical of cave-dwelling communities worldwide, since most underground societies developed oral rather than literate traditions, partly because of the practical difficulties of maintaining written materials in cave environments, and partly because cave communities tended to be small, egalitarian societies that did not require the complex administrative systems that typically drive the development of writing systems, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct their stories from material evidence alone. The distribution of artifacts within the Gyeongju caves reveals patterns of social organization that mirror those found in other cave communities, with evidence of nuclear family units occupying individual chambers while sharing communal spaces for cooking, food storage, and craft production, suggesting that cave life naturally evolved towards social structures that balanced individual privacy with collective security and resource sharing, creating communities that were more egalitarian and cooperative than most surface civilizations of the same historical period. The types of tools and equipment found at Gyeongju indicate that the cave dwellers maintained contact with surface civilizations through trade relationships or periodic expeditions, since some of the metal implements and ceramic vessels found in the caves show signs of manufacture techniques that were not available within the cave system itself, suggesting that even the most isolated cave communities could not achieve complete self-sufficiency and required some form of ongoing relationship with surface societies. The preservation conditions within limestone caves have allowed archaeologists to recover organic materials that would have decomposed in most surface archaeological sites, including fragments of textiles, wooden tools, food remains, and other perishable materials that provide unprecedented insights into the daily life of cave communities, revealing details about diet, clothing, crafts, and domestic activities that are rarely available from surface archaeological sites of comparable age. Comparative analysis of cave sites across China reveals that the Gyeongju complex was part of a larger network of underground communities that shared similar architectural techniques, tool technologies, and cultural practices, suggesting that cave-dwelling peoples maintained communication and cultural exchange relationships across considerable distances, perhaps through specialized traders or traveling craftsmen who carried innovations from one cave community to another. The environmental archaeology of the Gyeongju site provides evidence about the local climate and ecological conditions during the period of cave occupation, revealing that the cave dwellers lived through significant environmental changes that might have influenced their decision-making about resource management, population control, and ultimately their choice to abandon their underground sanctuary, contributing to our understanding of how prehistoric and historic communities adapted to climate variability. Recent applications of ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive archaeological techniques have revealed that the known chambers of Gaiaju represent only a fraction of the total cave system, with additional passages and chambers that remain unexplored, suggesting that the full scale and complexity of the cave community was even greater than previously understood, and that future archaeological investigation might reveal additional evidence about cave life that could transform our understanding of this remarkable civilization. The study of Gaiaju and similar cave sites has contributed to the development of new archaeological methodologies for investigating underground sites, including specialized techniques for documenting three-dimensional cave architecture, methods for analyzing the acoustic properties of cave chambers, and approaches to understanding the psychological and social implications of underground life, creating new tools that are being applied to cave sites around the world. The archaeological investigation of Gaiaju continues to raise more questions than it answers, since every new discovery reveals additional complexity in the cave dwellers' way of life, while simultaneously deepening the mystery of their origins, their cultural connections to other cave communities, and the circumstances that led them to abandon their perfectly functional underground city, leaving behind one of archaeology's most intriguing puzzles about human adaptability and the sustainability of alternative forms of civilization. The global pattern of cave-dwelling communities revealed by archaeological investigation suggests that the choice to live underground represents a recurring human response to specific types of environmental and social pressures, indicating that under appropriate conditions, cave life offers genuine advantages over surface existence, advantages that were sufficient to motivate numerous societies across history to develop the sophisticated technologies and social systems required for successful underground civilization. Modern scientific research into human adaptation to darkness provides remarkable insights into how the cave dwellers of Gaiaju might have evolved physiologically and psychologically to thrive in conditions that would challenge contemporary humans, revealing that the human body and mind possess far greater capacity for adaptation to extreme environments than most people realize, and that prolonged exposure to darkness triggers a cascade of biological changes that could have transformed the cave dwellers into a population uniquely suited for underground existence. Studies of contemporary cave explorers, underground workers, and participants in darkness immersion experiments have revealed that the human visual system can adapt to extremely low light conditions through a process called dark adaptation, where the pupils dilate, the retinas become more sensitive to available light, and the brain learns to process visual information more efficiently. But these adaptations typically take weeks or months to develop fully, suggesting that individuals born and raised in cave conditions would have possessed visual capabilities far beyond those of surface dwellers. The neurological implications of life in permanent darkness would have been profound, since the human brain normally relies heavily on visual input for spatial orientation, memory formation, and emotional regulation. But research with blind individuals and people who have spent extended periods in darkness reveals that the brain can dramatically reorganize itself to compensate for the absence of visual information, developing enhanced capabilities in hearing, touch, and spatial memory that would have been essential for successful navigation of complex cave systems. Circadian rhythm research has shown that humans can adapt to alternative light-dark cycles when removed from natural sunlight, but that such adaptation requires the establishment of new environmental cues for maintaining healthy sleep-wake patterns, suggesting that the cave dwellers would have needed to develop sophisticated social and behavioral routines to maintain circadian health, perhaps using meal times, community activities, and artificial lighting schedules to provide the temporal structure normally supplied by solar cycles. The psychological effects of prolonged darkness exposure have been extensively studied in contexts ranging from polar research stations to sensory deprivation experiments, revealing that while most people initially experience anxiety, disorientation, and depression when deprived of natural light, those who successfully adapt to dark environments often develop enhanced creativity, improved introspection, and deeper interpersonal connections, suggesting that the cave dwellers might have achieved forms of psychological development that were qualitatively different from but not necessarily inferior to surface dwellers. Research into vitamin D metabolism has revealed that humans can survive without direct sunlight exposure if they consume adequate amounts of vitamin D from dietary sources, particularly fish and certain plants, indicating that the cave dwellers could have maintained healthy bone development and immune function through careful attention to diet, possibly including the cultivation of vitamin D-rich foods within their cave environment or regular consumption of foods obtained during surface expeditions. Studies of calcium absorption and bone density in populations with limited sunlight exposure suggest that the cave dwellers would have been at risk for various health problems related to vitamin D deficiency, but that these risks could have been managed through dietary adaptations, physical activity patterns that maximized bone strength, and possibly the use of medicinal plants or other traditional health practices that could compensate for the absence of natural sunlight. The acoustic adaptation capabilities of humans living in cave environments have been documented in studies of blind individuals and people who work in underground settings, revealing that the human auditory system can develop extraordinary sensitivity and discriminatory ability when visual input is limited, including the ability to use echolocation for navigation, to identify individuals by subtle characteristics of their voice and movement, and to detect environmental changes through minute variations in ambient sound. Research into the psychological effects of confined spaces and limited social contact has revealed that successful adaptation to cave-like conditions requires specific personality characteristics and coping strategies, including high levels of stress tolerance, strong social skills for managing interpersonal conflicts in close quarters, and the ability to find meaning and satisfaction in limited environmental conditions, suggesting that cave communities would have naturally selected for individuals with psychological profiles suited for underground life. The metabolic implications of cave life have been studied through research with underground workers and cave explorers, revealing that the human body can adapt to reduced physical activity levels and different dietary patterns, but that such adaptations come with trade-offs in terms of cardiovascular fitness, muscle mass, and metabolic efficiency, indicating that the cave dwellers would have needed to develop exercise and activity patterns specifically designed to maintain physical health in confined conditions. Studies of genetic adaptation to environmental conditions suggest that populations living in extreme environments for multiple generations can develop heritable traits that improve survival and reproduction under those specific conditions, indicating that the cave dwellers might have been evolving genetic adaptations to darkness, confined spaces, and other characteristics of underground life, creating a population that was becoming increasingly specialized for cave existence. The immunological implications of cave life have been investigated through studies of communities living in isolated or confined conditions, revealing that such populations often develop unique disease resistance patterns, but may also be vulnerable to infections when exposed to pathogens from outside their isolated environment, suggesting that the cave dwellers would have had complex health advantages and disadvantages compared to surface populations. Research into the cognitive effects of sensory restriction has shown that people living in environments with limited sensory input often develop enhanced abilities in memory, pattern recognition, and abstract thinking, as the brain compensates for reduced environmental stimulation by becoming more efficient at processing and storing information, indicating that the cave dwellers might have possessed intellectual capabilities that were different from but potentially superior to those of surface dwellers in certain domains. The social psychology of small, isolated communities has been extensively studied in contexts ranging from Arctic research stations to religious communes, revealing that successful long-term survival in such conditions requires specific cultural practices and social institutions that manage conflict, maintain morale, and ensure cooperation, providing insights into the types of social systems that the cave dwellers would have needed to develop to sustain their underground civilization for centuries. Modern research into sustainable living practices and environmental adaptation provides a contemporary perspective on the cave dwellers' achievements, revealing that their success in creating a viable underground civilization required innovations in resource management, waste processing, energy efficiency, and social organization that parallel many of the sustainability challenges facing contemporary society. suggesting that the cave dwellers' experience offers valuable lessons for modern efforts to create environmentally sustainable communities. As we emerge from our journey into the depths of Tianhuang Mountain and return to the surface world of artificial lights and endless connectivity, the story of the Giaju cave dwellers offers us something more valuable than historical curiosity or archaeological fascination. It provides a mirror in which we can examine our own assumptions about what human beings require for happiness, security, and meaning, challenging our modern belief that more is always better, that technological complexity equals progress, that connection to the surface world is essential for human flourishing. The cave dwellers achieved something that contemporary civilization struggles to accomplish despite all our technological sophistication. They created a sustainable way of life that could continue indefinitely without depleting resources, destroying environments, or creating social inequalities that threatened community stability, and they did so using nothing more than stone tools, human intelligence, and social cooperation, proving that sustainability is not primarily a technological problem but a cultural and psychological challenge. Their success in creating meaningful lives within severe constraints offers profound lessons for our contemporary world, where many people feel overwhelmed by endless choices and opportunities, where the abundance of possibilities often leads to anxiety and dissatisfaction rather than fulfillment, where the constant stimulation of modern life can leave individuals feeling fragmented and disconnected from deeper sources of meaning and purpose, suggesting that limitations, properly embraced, can be liberating rather than restricting. The cave dwellers' mastery of their environment through intimate knowledge and careful observation contrasts sharply with our contemporary tendency to control environments through technological intervention rather than adaptation, to solve problems by changing external conditions rather than developing internal capabilities, to seek comfort through consumption rather than through the cultivation of resilience and resourcefulness, indicating that there may be forms of mastery and competence that we have lost in our pursuit of technological convenience. Their development of rich social relationships within small, stable communities offers an alternative to the social fragmentation and loneliness that characterize much of contemporary life, where individuals often struggle to form deep, lasting connections despite having access to global communication networks, where the scale and complexity of modern society can make people feel isolated and insignificant, despite being surrounded by millions of other human beings, suggesting that community health may depend more on intimacy and stability than on size and connectivity. The psychological resilience that cave life required, the ability to find satisfaction and meaning within limited circumstances, to maintain hope and purpose without external validation or stimulation, to create beauty and significance through human relationships and creative expression, rather than through material accumulation, represents a form of mental strength that could be valuable for anyone facing challenging circumstances or seeking alternatives to consumption-based approaches to happiness and fulfillment. Their sustainable resource management practices, developed through necessity but maintained through cultural wisdom, offer models for contemporary efforts to create more environmentally responsible ways of life, demonstrating that humans are capable of living within natural limits when they develop the social institutions and cultural values that support long-term thinking and collective restraint, rather than the short-term individual maximization that drives much contemporary economic activity. The cave dwellers' integration of practical skills with spiritual meaning, their understanding that survival requires not just technical competence but psychological and social health, their recognition that human communities need ritual, ceremony, and shared meaning to maintain cohesion and motivation over long periods, offers insights that could be valuable for contemporary communities struggling to balance material prosperity with deeper forms of human flourishing. Their ability to maintain cultural traditions and social knowledge without written records, through oral traditions and experiential learning, demonstrates the power of human memory and interpersonal teaching that we may have undervalued in our text-based, information-saturated culture, suggesting that some forms of wisdom and skill are better transmitted through direct experience and personal relationship than through abstract information transfer. The mystery of their ultimate abandonment of cave life serves as a reminder that even successful adaptations to challenging conditions may not be permanent. that human communities are dynamic systems that must continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances, that sustainability requires not just the ability to maintain existing practices, but the wisdom to recognize when fundamental changes are necessary for long-term survival and well-being. Their story challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about progress and development, suggesting that human advancement might sometimes involve choosing simplicity over complexity, depth over breadth, quality over quantity, community over individualism, adaptation over control, and that some of the most important human achievements may involve learning to live well within limits rather than constantly seeking to transcend or eliminate limitations. The cave dweller's legacy reminds us that human beings are far more adaptable and resourceful than we often assume, that we possess capabilities for resilience, cooperation, and creative problem-solving that we rarely have occasion to develop in contemporary life, that extreme circumstances can sometimes bring out the best in human nature rather than reducing us to mere survival mode, and that alternative ways of life are possible even under conditions that seem impossible or undesirable. Their example suggests that some of our contemporary problems, environmental destruction, social fragmentation, psychological distress, spiritual emptiness, might be addressed not through new technologies or institutional reforms, but through rediscovering human capabilities that we have allowed to atrophy, through developing forms of community and ways of life that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term convenience, through learning to find meaning and satisfaction in simpler but deeper forms of human experience. As we face contemporary challenges of climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, and psychological distress, the cave dwellers of Gaiaju offer us not a blueprint to be copied but an inspiration to be adapted, a demonstration that human beings are capable of creating viable alternatives to unsustainable ways of life, that community and creativity can flourish under conditions that seem restrictive, that the human spirit can find ways to thrive even in the deepest darkness, even in the most confining circumstances, even when forced to rely on nothing more than the fundamental capabilities that have sustained our species through countless generations of adaptation and survival. In the pre-dawn hours when the world hovers between sleep and waking, when the familiar boundaries of daytime consciousness begin to soften, and the deeper currents of human experience rise closer to the surface of awareness, there are moments when we can almost sense what it might have been like to live as the cave dwellers lived, surrounded by stone and shadow, dependent upon flame and community, connected to rhythms more ancient and fundamental than the artificial cycles that govern contemporary life. And in these moments of quiet darkness, we might glimpse something of what they found in the depths of Tianhuang Mountain, something that we have lost in our rush toward light and noise and constant stimulation. The story of the Gaiaju cave dwellers speaks to something deeper than historical curiosity or archaeological interest. It touches upon fundamental questions about what human beings actually need for happiness and meaning, about whether our contemporary assumptions about progress and development are leading us toward greater fulfillment or merely greater complexity, about whether the cave dwellers' choice to embrace limitation and darkness might have provided them with forms of richness and satisfaction that our abundance-oriented culture struggles to achieve. When we consider their daily lives, the intimate knowledge of every stone and passage in their underground world, the deep relationships formed through constant proximity and mutual dependence, the quiet satisfactions of craftsmanship and community cooperation, the sense of connection to elemental forces of earth and fire and water, the spiritual depth that comes from living close to the edge of survival where every day requires conscious choice and careful attention, we might recognize that they possessed forms of wealth that cannot be measured in material terms, forms of security that do not depend upon technological systems, forms of meaning that emerge from direct engagement with fundamental human needs and capabilities. Their mastery of darkness might be understood not as adaptation to deprivation, but as the development of sensory and psychological capabilities that most humans never have occasion to explore, the cultivation of inner resources that remain largely untapped in people whose lives are filled with external stimulation and distraction, the discovery of forms of awareness and consciousness that are available only to those who learn to be still, to listen deeply, to find their way through the world using senses and intuitions that go beyond the visual orientation that dominates contemporary culture. The cave dwellers' relationship to time would have been fundamentally different from our clock-driven, deadline-oriented contemporary experience, without sunrise and sunset to mark the passage of days, without seasonal changes to structure the year, without the artificial urgencies that fill modern schedules. They would have lived according to rhythms that were more closely connected to human biological cycles, community needs, and the slow geological processes that shaped their stone environment, experiencing time as a flowing river rather than a resource to be managed and consumed. Their understanding of space would also have been unique, since their entire world could be walked from end to end in a matter of hours, since every chamber and passage was known and familiar, since there were no distant horizons or unexplored territories to dream about. Yet within this confined physical space they created richness and variety through human relationships, cultural traditions, spiritual practices and craftsmanship, proving that geographical limitation need not mean experiential poverty, that depth can compensate for breadth, that intimate knowledge of a small place can be more satisfying than superficial acquaintance with vast territories. The psychological implications of their choice to live underground speak to contemporary questions about anxiety, depression, and the search for meaning in a complex and overwhelming world. The cave dwellers simplified their environment to a scale that could be fully understood and controlled, eliminated most sources of external stimulation and distraction, focused their attention on the fundamental requirements of survival and community, and in doing so may have avoided many of the psychological stresses that plague contemporary life, finding peace and satisfaction through limitation rather than expansion, through community rather than individual achievement, through adaptation rather than conquest. Their spiritual understanding of their environment as sacred space, their recognition that survival required not just practical skills, but ritual observance and respectful relationship with forces beyond human control, their integration of daily life with transcendent meaning, offers an alternative to the secular materialism that dominates contemporary culture, suggesting that humans may require spiritual as well as physical nourishment, that meaning and purpose may be as essential for survival as food and shelter, that the separation between sacred and secular that characterizes modern life may impoverish human experience in ways that are difficult to recognize but impossible to ignore. The mystery of their eventual abandonment of cave life reminds us that all human adaptations are temporary, that even the most successful ways of life must eventually change or disappear, that the communities and cultures we create today will someday be archaeological sites that future investigators struggle to understand, that our contemporary civilization, despite its apparent permanence and global reach, is as fragile and contingent as the cave communities that preceded it, as dependent upon favorable circumstances and wise choices as the most isolated mountain settlement. Yet their story also suggests that human creativity and adaptability are inexhaustible, that when faced with impossible circumstances, people find ways to not merely survive but create beauty, meaning, and community, that the human spirit possesses resources that are revealed only under extreme conditions, that some of our most important capabilities remain dormant until circumstances require us to discover them, that we may be capable of forms of life and consciousness that we have never had occasion to explore. As we continue to face challenges that require fundamental changes in how we live, environmental degradation that demands new relationships with natural systems, social fragmentation that calls for deeper forms of community, psychological distress that points toward the need for alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction, the cave dwellers of Gyaju offer us not specific solutions, but proof that alternatives are possible, that humans can create viable ways of life under conditions that seem impossible, that limitation and darkness need not mean despair or deprivation, but can become the foundation for forms of richness and fulfillment that abundance-oriented cultures struggle to achieve. In the end, their story is not about the past but about possibilities that remain available to us, about human capabilities that we carry within ourselves but rarely have occasion to explore, about forms of community and consciousness that could emerge if we had the courage to embrace limitation as liberation, darkness as revelation, the depths of the earth as a place of transformation rather than exile, the shadow as a teacher rather than an enemy, the cave as a womb of possibility rather than a tomb of despair. Today, if you stand at the entrance to the Gyaju caves in the quiet hours before dawn, when the mountain mist still clings to the limestone cliffs and the only sounds are the distant calls of birds awakening in the valley below, you might imagine that you can hear something more than wind moving through the empty chambers, the faint echo of voices that once filled these passages, the ghostly sound of footsteps on stone stairs worn smooth by generations of use, the whispered conversations of children who learned to find their way through absolute darkness by touch and sound and intuition. The chambers that once sheltered entire families now stand empty, their carefully carved walls bearing the tool marks of craftsmen whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose stories have been reduced to the archaeological evidence they left behind in the stone itself, cooking fires that blackened ceilings, sleeping platforms that held the dreams of people who never saw sunrise, storage niches that preserved grain and tools against uncertainties that ultimately proved insurmountable, workshops where the patient work of generations created the infrastructure that made underground life possible. But the physical remains tell only part of the story, because the true legacy of the cave dwellers lives not in their abandoned architecture, but in the demonstration they provided of human adaptability, creativity, and resilience, in their proof that people can create meaning and community under conditions that seem impossible, that limitation can become the foundation for innovation, that darkness can be a teacher rather than an enemy, that the depths of the earth can nurture human life as surely as the surface world, given sufficient wisdom, cooperation, and determination. Their experiment in underground living lasted for centuries, long enough for multiple generations to be born, raised and buried within the stone chambers, long enough for cultural traditions to evolve and mature, long enough for the community to develop sophisticated solutions to the technical and social challenges of cave life. Long enough to prove that their alternative way of life was not a temporary aberration, but a viable form of human civilization, as legitimate and valuable as any surface society, as worthy of respect and study as the great cities and empires that dominated the historical record. The questions their story raises are as relevant today as they were when the last cave dweller sealed the entrance to their underground world and walked away into the uncertain sunlight of the surface world. Questions about sustainability and community, about the relationship between material complexity and human satisfaction, about the psychological and spiritual requirements for a meaningful life, about the forms of security and prosperity that actually matter for human well-being, about the price we pay for the choices we make about how to live. Modern visitors to the Gyaju caves often report a profound sense of peace and stillness that is difficult to find in the contemporary world, a silence that seems to hold the accumulated quiet of centuries, a darkness that offers rest from the constant visual stimulation of modern life, a sense of shelter and protection that speaks to psychological needs that many people don't recognize until they experience their absence, a feeling of being held by the earth itself in a way that surface structures, no matter how grand or comfortable, cannot provide. The acoustic properties of the caves continue to amaze visitors and researchers as voices carry through passages in ways that seem almost supernatural, as whispered words spoken in one chamber can be heard clearly in adjacent rooms, as the stone walls seem to preserve and amplify human speech in ways that make conversations feel more intimate and significant than they do in ordinary circumstances, creating an environment where every word carries weight, where communication becomes more careful and meaningful, where the act of speaking becomes almost ritualized. Archaeological investigation of the caves continues to reveal new details about cave life, as advanced imaging techniques map previously unknown passages, as analysis of soil samples reveals information about diet and health, as dating methods become more precise and provide clearer timelines for the occupation and abandonment of the site, as comparative studies with other cave communities around the world reveal patterns and connections that help us understand the broader phenomenon of human adaptation to underground environments. But perhaps the most important discoveries about the cave dwellers come not from scientific investigation, but from imaginative engagement with their story, from the effort to understand what it might have felt like to live as they lived, to see the world as they saw it, to find meaning and satisfaction within the constraints they accepted, to experience community and creativity under conditions that most contemporary people would find unbearable, to develop forms of consciousness and capability that remain largely unexplored in modern life. Their legacy challenges us to examine our own assumptions about what we require for happiness and security, to consider whether our contemporary pursuit of material abundance and technological complexity is leading us toward greater fulfillment or merely greater complication, to explore whether some of the forms of richness and satisfaction they discovered in their stone chambers might be available to us in our surface world, if we knew how to look for them, if we had the courage to embrace them. The cave dwellers remind us that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation and creativity when circumstances require it, that community and cooperation can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, that meaning and beauty can be created under the most unlikely conditions, that the human spirit possesses resources that are revealed only when we are stripped of the external supports and distractions that normally sustain us, that some of our most important capabilities remain dormant until extreme circumstances call them forth. Their story suggests that contemporary civilization, for all its achievements and advantages, may be missing something essential that they discovered in their underground sanctuary, forms of community that provide genuine security and belonging, relationships with the natural world that are based on respect and adaptation rather than domination and control, ways of life that are sustainable not just environmentally but psychologically and spiritually, sources of meaning that do not depend upon constant growth and accumulation but emerge from depth and quality of experience. As we face contemporary challenges that may require fundamental changes in how we live, environmental crises that demand new relationships with natural systems, social problems that call for deeper forms of community, psychological difficulties that point toward the need for alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction, the cave dwellers of Gaiaju offer us not a model to be copied but an inspiration to be adapted, proof that alternatives are possible, that humans can create viable ways of life even under conditions that seem impossible, that limitation and constraint need not mean deprivation, but can become the foundation for forms of richness that abundance-oriented cultures struggle to achieve. In the end, their whispers that still echo through the empty chambers of Tianwang Mountain speak to possibilities that remain available to us, human capabilities that we carry within ourselves but rarely explore, forms of community and consciousness that could emerge if we had the wisdom to learn from their example, the courage to embrace their insights, and the creativity to adapt their discoveries to the challenges and opportunities of our own time. As our journey through the depths of Tianwang Mountain draws to a close, as we follow the worn stone steps that lead from the innermost chambers back toward the surface world, climbing through passages that have remained unchanged since the last cave dweller made this same journey centuries ago, we carry with us more than historical knowledge or archaeological information. We bring the gift of perspective that comes from having glimpsed, however briefly, an alternative way of being human, a different relationship with darkness and light, limitation and possibility, community and solitude, time and space. The entrance to the caves grows brighter as we approach it, natural sunlight beginning to compete with the artificial illumination that has guided our underground exploration, and in this gradual transition from the eternal night of the cave depths to the ordinary daylight of the surface world, we might experience something of what the cave dwellers would have felt during their occasional expeditions beyond their stone sanctuary, the overwhelming brightness, the infinite expanse of sky, the bewildering complexity of a world where horizons disappear into distant haze and the eye struggles to process visual information that extends far beyond the intimate scale of stone chambers and connecting passages. But we also return to the surface world with new appreciation for things we might have taken for granted. The simple miracle of electric lights that banish darkness with the flip of a switch, the luxury of windows that connect interior spaces to external vistas, the freedom to move through unlimited space without the constant awareness of stone walls and low ceilings, the convenience of technologies that the cave dwellers could never have imagined, the social opportunities that come from living in communities of thousands or millions rather than dozens. Yet the contrast between cave life and surface life is not simply a matter of primitive versus advanced, limited versus unlimited, difficult versus easy. It is a more complex comparison between different forms of human experience, different ways of organizing consciousness and community, different approaches to the fundamental questions of meaning, security, and satisfaction that every human society must address, different solutions to the eternal human challenge of creating viable ways of life within the constraints and possibilities that circumstances provide. The cave dwellers chose depth over breadth, intimacy over diversity, sustainability over growth, adaptation over control, and in making these choices they discovered forms of richness and fulfillment that our surface civilization, for all its achievements and advantages, struggles to provide. The deep security that comes from intimate knowledge of one's environment, the psychological peace that emerges from simplified circumstances, the social cohesion that develops in small communities where everyone's survival depends upon cooperation and mutual care, the spiritual awareness that can flourish when external distractions are minimized and attention turns inward. Their story reminds us that human happiness and meaning do not necessarily require the material abundance and technological sophistication that contemporary civilization takes as measures of progress and development, that some of the most important forms of wealth cannot be accumulated or consumed but must be cultivated through relationship, community, and conscious choice, that the human spirit possesses resources that are revealed only when we are challenged to discover them, only when comfortable assumptions are stripped away and we are forced to rely upon fundamental capabilities that modern life rarely requires us to develop. The mystery of their eventual abandonment of cave life serves as a reminder that all human adaptations are temporary, that even the most successful ways of life must continue to evolve or risk extinction, that the communities and cultures we create today are as contingent and fragile as the cave civilization that preceded them, as dependent upon wisdom, cooperation, and favorable circumstances as the most isolated mountain settlement, as vulnerable to the forces of change that shape all human history. But their story also demonstrates that human creativity and resilience are inexhaustible, that when faced with challenging circumstances, people find ways to create not just survival strategies, but beauty, meaning, and community, that the human capacity for adaptation extends far beyond what we normally have occasion to explore, that possibilities for alternative ways of life exist even under conditions that seem impossible or undesirable, that limitations can become opportunities for forms of development that unlimited circumstances never provide. As we step from the cave entrance into the full brightness of morning sunlight, as our eyes slowly adjust to the overwhelming visual complexity of the surface world, as we begin the journey back to our contemporary lives with their familiar comforts and complications, we might pause for a moment to consider what we have learned from our time in the depths, what insights we might carry forward, what questions their story raises about our own choices and assumptions and possibilities. The cave dwellers lived for centuries in conditions that most contemporary people would consider intolerable, yet they apparently found those conditions not just bearable but meaningful, not just sustainable but fulfilling, not just survivable but worthy of a lifetime's commitment, suggesting that human satisfaction and well-being depend less upon external circumstances than upon the internal resources we bring to whatever conditions we face, less upon what we have than upon how we understand and engage with what we have. Their legacy is not a call to abandon contemporary civilization and retreat to caves, but an invitation to consider what elements of their approach to life might be adapted to our current circumstances, what forms of community and consciousness they developed that could enrich our contemporary experience, what insights about sustainability and cooperation and meaning they discovered that could inform our response to current challenges and opportunities. In a world facing environmental crises that require fundamental changes in how we live, social fragmentation that calls for deeper forms of community, psychological distress that points toward the need for alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction, the cave dwellers of Gayaju offer us not specific solutions but proof that alternatives are possible, that humans can create viable ways of life even under extreme constraints, that limitation and simplicity need not mean deprivation, but can become the foundation for forms of richness that abundance-oriented cultures struggle to achieve. Their whispers still echo through the empty chambers of Tianwang Mountain, reminding us of possibilities that remain available, human capabilities that we carry within ourselves but rarely explore, forms of community and consciousness that could emerge if we had the courage to learn from their example, the wisdom to adapt their insights to contemporary conditions, the creativity to discover what they discovered, that the human spirit can flourish in the deepest darkness, that meaning can be found in the most unlikely places, that community can thrive under the most challenging conditions, that the cave, like the heart, contains infinite space for those who know how to enter it. As you return to your own life, to your own choices about how to live and what to value, Carry with you the memory of those who chose the depths over the surface, shadow over light, limitation over expansion, and who found in their stone sanctuary not a prison but a temple, not a retreat from life but a different way of embracing it, not an end but a beginning, not darkness, but a different form of illumination that continues to shine across the centuries, calling to those who have eyes to see and hearts to understand. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the depths of time and stone. If this exploration has moved you, please subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the hidden corners of human experience, and share in the comments your own thoughts about what we might learn from those who chose to live in the darkness, and what their example might mean for how we navigate the challenges and opportunities of our own time. The cave dwellers await your return.